Berlin, April 1945. The city is dying. Soviet shells fall every few seconds. Buildings collapse into rubble. Fires burn on every street. The smell of smoke and death hangs in the air, deep underground, in a concrete bunker beneath the destroyed capital. Adolf Hitler is preparing to die, but someone has to protect him. Someone has to hold off the Soviet army while the Führer says his final goodbyes. Someone has to command the last defense of the Third Reich. That someone is Wilhelm Mohnke, SS general, war criminal, the man who would defend Hitler's bunker until the very end, and then somehow escape justice for the rest of his life. This is his story, a story of loyalty to a madman, a story of atrocities that were never punished, a story of a man who should have faced a firing squad, but instead died peacefully in his bed at age 90. How did he do it? How did one of the most wanted war criminals in history live a free man for over 50 years? Let me tell you. Wilhelm Mohnke was born on March 15, 1911, in the city of Lübeck in northern Germany. He grew up in a middle-class family. His father was a merchant. There was nothing special about his childhood. But Mohnke came of age during a turbulent time. Germany had lost World War I. The economy was in ruins. Millions were unemployed. People were desperate for change. Adolf Hitler offered that change. He promised to make Germany great again. He promised jobs, pride, and revenge against those who had humiliated the nation. Mohnke believed him. In 1931, at the age of 20, Wilhelm Mohnke joined the Nazi Party. 2 years later, he joined the SS. He was one of the early believers, a true fanatic who would follow Hitler anywhere. He joined the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the most elite unit in the entire SS. This was Hitler's personal bodyguard unit. Only the most loyal, most dedicated, most fanatical Nazis were accepted. Mohnke fit right in. He was tall, blond, and athletic. He looked exactly like the Nazi ideal of an Aryan warrior. More importantly, he was utterly devoted to Hitler and the Nazi cause. When World War II began in September 1939, Mohnke was ready to prove his loyalty. He would prove it in ways that haunt history to this day. The Leibstandarte fought in Poland, then France, then Greece and Yugoslavia. Everywhere they went, they won victories. And everywhere they went, they left atrocities behind. But the incident that would define Mohnke's legacy happened in May 1940, during the invasion of France. British forces were retreating to Dunkirk, trying to escape across the English Channel. Near a small village called Wormhout, a group of about 80 British soldiers surrendered to Mohnke's unit. What happened next was a war crime. The prisoners were marched to a barn. They were packed inside like animals. Then SS soldiers began throwing grenades through the windows. Explosions tore through the crowded barn. Men screamed. Bodies were ripped apart. Those who survived the grenades were shot. When it was over, at least 80 British prisoners were dead. Some estimates say the number was higher. This became known as the Wormhout Massacre. Who gave the order? Witnesses said it was Wilhelm Mohnke. He was the commanding officer. He was responsible. But Mohnke denied it for the rest of his life. He claimed he was not there. He claimed he knew nothing about it. The truth died with the men in that barn. The war continued. Mohnke was wounded several times. He lost a foot to a landmine in Yugoslavia. But he kept fighting. He kept rising through the ranks. By 1944, he was an SS colonel, one of the most senior officers in the Waffen-SS. He commanded troops on the Western Front during the Allied invasion of Normandy. And there, another massacre occurred. On June 7th, 1944, just one day after D-Day, Canadian prisoners of war were captured near the village of Authie. They were young men, some barely out of their teens, who had come to liberate Europe. They never got the chance. SS soldiers from the 12th SS Panzer Division murdered at least 20 Canadian prisoners that day. They were shot in the back of the head. Their bodies were left in the fields. More killings followed. Over the next few days, over 150 Canadian prisoners were murdered by the SS. It was systematic. It was deliberate. It was policy. Mohnke was in the area. He held command authority. Whether he personally ordered the killings or simply allowed them to happen, he bore responsibility. After the war, Canadian investigators desperately wanted to prosecute him. They had witness testimonies. They had evidence. They had a list of names. Mohnke's name was near the top, but they would never get him. We will find out why later. By April 1945, the war was clearly lost. Everyone knew it. Everyone except perhaps Hitler himself, who still believed in miracle victories that would never come. The Soviet army was closing in on Berlin. Millions of soldiers surrounded the city. The end was days away. On April 23, 1945, Hitler gave Wilhelm Mohnke his final command. Defend the government district of Berlin. Defend the Reich Chancellery. Defend the Führer bunker. Mohnke had about 2,000 men under his command. Waffen-SS soldiers, Hitler Youth, old men from the Volkssturm militia, boys and grandfathers, fighting against the largest army in the world. It was hopeless. Everyone knew it was hopeless. But Mohnke obeyed. He organized his forces into battle groups. He positioned men in ruined buildings. He set up machine gun nests and anti-tank positions. He prepared to fight to the death. Above ground, Berlin was being destroyed block by block. Soviet artillery pounded the city without mercy. Soviet infantry advanced through the rubble, fighting for every street, every building, every room. Below ground, in the bunker, Hitler was falling apart. He raged at his generals. He accused everyone of betrayal. He moved imaginary armies on maps while real armies died above. He was a broken man, living in a fantasy world while his empire crumbled. Mohnke visited the bunker regularly to report on the situation. He saw Hitler in those final days. He saw the shaking hands, the pale skin, the dead eyes. But he kept fighting. He kept sending men to die for a lost cause. On April 28, 1945, Hitler married Eva Braun in the bunker. It was a bizarre ceremony, a wedding in a tomb. Champagne was served while shells exploded above. Mohnke attended the small reception afterward. He stood in that cramped underground room, surrounded by the last remnants of Nazi leadership, celebrating a marriage that would last less than 2 days. Hitler pulled Mohnke aside. The Führer wanted a situation report. How long could they hold out? Mohnke told him the truth. The Soviets were less than a mile away. They would reach the bunker within 24 to 48 hours. There was no hope of relief. There was no escape. Hitler listened. Then he made his decision. He would kill himself rather than be captured. On April 30th, 1945, the end came. In the afternoon, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun retired to their private room. Eva bit down on a cyanide capsule. Hitler put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger. Their bodies were carried up to the garden and burned with gasoline. The Führer was dead. The Third Reich was finished, but Mohnke was still alive, and he had no intention of dying in that bunker. That night, Mohnke organized a breakout. About 500 people, soldiers, secretaries, nurses, officials, would try to escape through the Soviet lines. They would move through the subway tunnels and ruined buildings, hoping to reach the German forces to the west. It was a desperate gamble. Soviet soldiers were everywhere. The city was a maze of fire and death. Mohnke led one of the groups personally. They moved through the darkness, climbing over rubble, crawling through sewers, listening for Soviet patrols. By morning, they had traveled several miles, but they were exhausted. Soviet forces were closing in. Mohnke realized escape was impossible. On May 2nd, 1945, Wilhelm Mohnke surrendered to the Soviet army. The man who had defended Hitler's bunker to the end was now a prisoner of the Soviets. What happened next is where the story takes a strange turn. You would expect a senior SS general to be put on trial. You would expect the Soviets to hand him over to the British and Canadians who wanted him for war crimes. You would expect justice. None of that happened. Mohnke was taken to Moscow. He was interrogated by Soviet intelligence. He spent the next 10 years in Soviet prison camps, but he was never put on trial. Why not? The Soviets were more interested in information than justice. Mohnke had been in the bunker during Hitler's final days. He knew secrets. He had seen things. The Soviets wanted to know everything about Hitler's death, about the bunker, about the Nazi leadership. Mohnke talked. He gave them information, and in return, he was kept as a prisoner rather than executed. Meanwhile, the British and Canadians tried to get him. They filed requests. They demanded extradition. They had evidence of war crimes at Wormhout and Normandy. The Soviets refused. Mohnke was their prisoner. They would not hand him over. The Cold War was beginning. The alliance between West and East was falling apart. Cooperation on war criminals became impossible. Mohnke sat in Soviet camps, protected from Western justice by the Iron Curtain. In 1955, 10 years after the war ended, Wilhelm Mohnke was released. He returned to West Germany. He walked off a train a free man. No charges, no trial, no punishment. The British and Canadians still wanted him. But now there was a new problem. West Germany had its own laws about war crimes, and those laws made prosecution extremely difficult. Witnesses had died. Evidence had been lost. Memories had faded. The German legal system required proof beyond reasonable doubt. And after 10 years, that proof was hard to find. Investigators tried anyway. In 1988, German prosecutors opened a new investigation into the Wormhout massacre. They interviewed Mohnke. They gathered what evidence remained. But in 1993, the investigation was closed. Insufficient evidence, they said. The case could not be proven in court. Mohnke would never face trial. What kind of life did Wilhelm Mohnke live after the war? A comfortable one. He settled in Hamburg. He found work as a salesman for a truck company. He married. He had a normal, quiet, middle-class life. He never expressed remorse. He never admitted guilt. When journalists asked about Wormhout, he denied everything. When historians investigated, he refused to cooperate. He lived freely in Germany for almost 50 years after his release from Soviet captivity. Think about that. The man who likely ordered the murder of 80 British prisoners. The man who commanded troops that murdered over 100 Canadian prisoners. The man who defended Hitler's bunker to the very end. lived a peaceful retirement in Hamburg. He went to restaurants. He walked in parks. He celebrated birthdays and holidays. He grew old, surrounded by family. His victims never got old. They stayed forever young, dead in a barn in France, dead in fields in Normandy. Their lives stolen by men who were never punished. Wilhelm Mohnke died on August 6th, 2001. He was 90 years old. He died in a hospital bed, peacefully, surrounded by family. No trial, no prison, no justice. The Wormhout survivors and their families had waited over 60 years. The Canadian families had waited over 60 years. They never got their day in court. When Mohnke died, one British survivor said, "I always hoped I would see him face justice. Now I know it will never happen. He got away with murder." And he did. How did Wilhelm Mohnke escape justice? It was a perfect storm of circumstances. First, the Soviets captured him instead of the Western Allies. They kept him locked away for 10 years while evidence faded and witnesses died. Second, the Cold War prevented cooperation. The British and Canadians could not get him from the Soviets. By the time he was released, prosecution was much harder. Third, the German legal system made it difficult to try old cases. The standard of proof was high. The passage of time worked in favor of the accused. Fourth, Mohnke was smart. He never admitted anything. He never confessed. He always had an excuse, always had a denial, always had someone else to blame. And fifth, perhaps most importantly, the world moved on. People wanted to forget the war. They wanted to rebuild. They wanted to look forward, not backward. War criminals like Mohnke benefited from this exhaustion. Justice requires energy. Justice requires memory. When people are tired of remembering, the guilty go free. What should we think about Wilhelm Mohnke? He was a true believer. He joined the Nazis early and stayed loyal until the very end. While others ran or surrendered, he kept fighting. He defended Hitler's bunker until there was nothing left to defend. Was that courage, or was it fanaticism? He was almost certainly a war criminal. The evidence at Wormhout and Normandy points to his responsibility. Survivors identified him. Investigators concluded he gave orders, but he was never convicted. Does that make him innocent? Or does it just mean he was lucky? He lived a long life, 90 years, longer than most people. He had decades of peace and comfort, while his victims had nothing. Is that fair? Of course not. But history is not about fairness. History is about what happened. And what happened is this. A man who likely murdered prisoners in 1940, who commanded troops that massacred young Canadians in 1944, who defended Hitler to the final moment, lived peacefully until 2001. He beat the system. He escaped justice. He won. And that might be the most disturbing part of his story. The last defenders of Hitler's bunker scattered after the war. Some were captured. Some were killed. Some escaped and were never found. Wilhelm Mohnke was captured, but never punished. He returned to Germany and lived as if nothing had happened. He never apologized. He never admitted guilt. He never faced his victims or their families. When he died, the last chance for justice died with him. Today, when historians write about the final days of the Third Reich, Wilhelm Mohnke is a footnote. The SS general who held the bunker, the man who organized the final breakout, the survivor. But to the families of the men murdered at Wormhout, to the families of the Canadians killed in Normandy, he's something else entirely. He is the one who got away. He is proof that sometimes Evil wins. He is a reminder that justice is not guaranteed, that war criminals can live long, comfortable lives, that the worst people sometimes escape the consequences of their actions. That is the legacy of Wilhelm Mohnke. Not courage, not loyalty, not military skill. Just a man who did terrible things and never paid the price.